Dee asks this, Rick and Danny, you know, when we've gotten tonight's information, what other prerequisite homework can we do and where can we access it? Do we have any other information kind of to point volunteers to outside of the actual presentation that will be linked in this recording?
Sure, this is Danny, and I'll handle that. We have a 2-page summary about Alan Lerman's study, and we have a 10-page FAQ, which really, if you read that, you get all the important points and conclusions from his study. And both of those are available on CCL Community. If you look up Dividend Delivery in the search bar, a page will come up, the Dividend. And if you click on that, you'll be able to find both of those documents as well as the original CCU webinar that I did when we originally released this study. So that would be those original resources, and that's where you can find them.
Great. And just on that topic, these slides will be also linked along with the recording. And if you go to the Learning Center and then go to the prior lessons, there's a tab, or called Recent Training rather. By tomorrow midday, those should all be linked there. So feel free, you can also find it on the home page every week. It updates the most recent pages that are added with new content, either way through the Learning Center and recent trainings or on the home page with recent updates. Great questions. And I hear somebody else asking this. Sandy asks, why is the dividend limited to 2 children? In my part of the world, there's actually a lot of families that are much larger, and I think this will be a question from my district.
Sure, that's actually something that is addressed in the FAQ, but the short answer is there are huge economies of scale in terms of efficiency of carbon emission with more people living under the same roof. And if you think about the United States, the average household is about 2 children. So we were trying to take in those economies of scale. We were trying to take into account the households and the average, and we came up with 2 children. So there are of course other ways of doing this. You could do it other ways, but that's what we were thinking about. Your carbon emissions really do per person drop off significantly as you add more people into the same household.
Thank you, Danny. One last question, I think, and then we'll move on here. I see one more in the chat, and I'll just say this as well. I just put a link in the chat box to the referral that Danny mentioned to the frequently asked question, and I'll also put one of the recent trainings as well for people to find. Danny and Rick, what would you say about David's excellent question, and I think we'll probably get to this even a bit more, which immigrants would receive the dividend?
Let me take that one. This is something that, of course, is of great concern, especially to the EJ communities, and my congressman in particular, who is Luis Gutierrez. And right now, as it stands, we would include the individual taxpayer ID number as a valid way to get the dividend. So there are a number of immigrants that do have those. I think about 1 million, although that's a minority. But it's something that we're working on, looking for other options, other ways to address undocumented communities as well. Anything to add, Danny?
Yeah, you know, the CCL policy is to try and get to as many people who are resident in this country as possible. We try our best to use the term resident instead of citizen in all of our publications. I think that citizen does slip out a couple of times, probably because our name is Citizens Climate Lobby, so it's on the name. But it is to residents. But you do. There is a problem that you confront, and that is, which is pretty difficult to figure out. And as Rick said, he's working on that with his member of Congress, and that is that undocumented migrants are undocumented, and at a certain point, you need to have some documentation to send people money. So that's a difficult problem. It's a problem we're interested in solving. We are dedicating time to it. But fundamentally, we want this to go to everybody who is resident in this country.
Bob was very complimentary in thanking you for what you do, Danny, and earlier had asked in a recent progressive outreach call, this idea of opting out of your option on the dividend and then having that go towards some other project in support of environmental justice was floated. What is CCL HQ's position on that? What do you recommend volunteers in the field do in describing this possibility? Should this be entertained, or do we need to focus on our original policy?
Wow, Bob, that's a great question. I do think that that's something that you can entertain. You should be clear that is not something that CCL is going to include in our initial position, our initial bargaining position, because that is something that makes it more complicated. But I think that at least when I was living in California, this is something that California does. They give 20, 30 options for people. If they have a refund on their state taxes, they can dedicate them to other causes. And so this idea suggested itself to me as a way to, yes, gain support on the left. And I think that developing this idea further, particularly with those in the EJ community, I think there are other communities on the left who would be interested in this. I think that that could be a productive way forward. So once we do get to the point where this is suggested, this could be something, an idea that EJ communities or others suggest as something that would that could be an amendment to this as this works its way through Congress. But some things that occurred to me about this, it's a lot of money, and it does democratize where tax revenues go to, and that could be a pretty radical idea if you're giving citizens direct control over where monies are going to. And but the bottom line is that I think it's an interesting idea, and I do think it can help you get buy-in with those groups you're working with. And as long as you understand that that's not going to be a part of the original opening bid for CCL, I think it could be productive to work on.
Excellent. And adding to that then, what would you both say, given that you're both involved with kind of environmental justice outreach engagement along with the other stakeholders we're working with, are EJ leaders invited for input in the policy creation stage so far? Have they been in the past? Have there been potential problem areas and amendments to make this solution more equitable already?
Rick, would you like to start?
Well, I would say that we're trying to address that through our outreach to members of Congress and their staffers who are involved with EJ communities. And like I mentioned, my congressman has an environmental staffer who came out of the EJ community. So we're trying to work kind of through the congressional staff to address that problem rather than reaching out directly to EJ communities, although that's certainly an option. And I can't say what's going on throughout all of the different groups in CCL along those lines. Yeah,
and I'll just add, I mean, I think that you all know the story of how this was created, and Marshall asked somebody a lawyer, Lori Williams, to draw up a bill. She gave him a 10-page bill, and then he just went through it and crossed out sections that he thought was not necessary. And what we ended up with is the 2-page proposal, which is on our website. It's been there've been very small changes since. So that's the way that we came up with this policy, and we're sticking with that because it's working. But there is going to be a potential to put in more feedback when this does go through the legislative process, and I think that that's again a place where we can work with not just EJ communities but with others, and help them work on getting their views incorporated into this. But there is a dance there. There's a dance to be done because from the CCL national perspective, our policies are policy, and that's going to be our opening bid. It would be for you in your personal relationship that you're developing with those groups. So anyway, there's a dance there.
Excellent. And on that, oh, go for it. Am I hearing something else?
Yeah, I would like to also add that our policy, just like the Climate Solutions Caucus, is really designed to be a bipartisan proposal at the point where, if there's any chance of it getting passed. And so that would enhance the ability of members of Congress who have close relationships with the EJ communities to introduce amendments, as Danny suggested. I think the bipartisan part is an important factor in getting those inputs where the policy is really going to be developed on the congressional level.
Excellent. And Dee's comments also are addressing just the importance of tying this into the Jemez principles, which we learned about on the environmental justice webinar, as well as just keeping in mind women of color are more negatively impacted on climate issues, to really make sure that their voices are represented in the ongoing policy planning process. Thank you very much, Dee, for uplifting that important perspective. Jack asks this question, with the dividend delivery study or other analysis that's been done, why have we settled on monthly checks? Why is it most efficient for month to month versus quarter or twice yearly?
This is actually addressed in the FAQ. And surprisingly, it may not be less expensive to do quarterly or even twice a year. And what Alan identified is that typically the cost is going to be corrections. And people tend to forget what they're doing. So if you have a less frequent payment, then you might actually get more questions because people forget what's going on. And especially if you're doing electronic fund transfers, there's very low cost to that. And why monthly checks? It's because Marshall, given his background and his investment in microcredit, was very, very concerned about the poor. And he was concerned monthly, people do have trouble meeting their monthly expenses. And if you don't have a monthly check, they're going to have higher expenses from the increased costs of fossil fuels and the cost that carries through the economy. And they may have trouble meeting their monthly bills. So a monthly check is very important from the CCL perspective. And it's not experience. Alan's experience shows that it is not necessarily going to be more expensive. It may actually even be less expensive than doing quarterly or biannually.
Excellent. Moving on, this is a great question that David asks that I think we get a lot in the field as we do make presentations and especially talk with business leaders. I think just teasing out again this pay-go 25% haircut rule is really helpful to hear one more time. He asks, the pay-as-you-go concern about, it seems to be about the drag on the economy and the resulting reduction in federal tax income because of that. But by recycling the dividends, the economy is forecast to improve, which would increase tax income to the government, even without taxing the dividend. So why then do we have to tax that?
That's using dynamic scoring, which the CBO, there is academic hazard in doing that. And so what the CBO has traditionally done, I do believe that when Republicans took the House, they may have changed this. So that I'm not sure, but there is hazard in predicting growth and from increased revenues. And there are different schools of thought in economics which would predict very different outcomes. So what most economists have done is they have not predicted that growth, and they have used this conservative assumption that if the federal government raises $100 billion, then they're actually going to be getting $25 billion less from other places because businesses who are paying that $100 billion can write off some of it. And so if businesses are writing that off, and they're not paying those taxes, but you return 100 billion to households, then the federal government actually has 25 billion less, and that increases the deficit. So that's the fundamental problem. And CBO has a long-standing practice of assuming that and being cautious in assuming growth. That may have changed, and as stated, a lot is going to depend on what the CBO gets back to us with. But we are preparing for the most difficult situation, because that puts us into the best situation for this.
Excellent. And on this note, with kind of the interaction of the pay-go rule, just again as another repeat, why isn't it simpler, especially from kind of a conservative perspective, to just deduct the lost excise tax, that revenue from the carbon fund before distribution?
It is simpler. So what you would do is, if you were to raise $100 billion, the government would keep 25 billion, and only 75 billion would go back to households as a tax-free dividend. But because we have a progressive income tax system, that would mean that instead of getting, let's say, $1, a household would get 75 cents. And so that poor household was paying no taxes on that dollar, because they don't make enough money. They're also not paying any taxes on that 75 cents, because they only have 75 cents instead of $1. And if you get in the higher tax brackets, in the first scenario, they're getting $1, but they're again paying 35 cents back in income taxes. But in the other situation, where you're just returning 75 billion, they're getting 75 cents and they're keeping 75 cents. So if you do it that way, it is simpler, the accounting is easier, but it is less progressive. You guarantee that it is revenue neutral by the CBO. You make it harder for lower income groups. And there is also the optics issue. If the government is keeping 25% of the revenue off the bat, instead of returning it, yes, they're collecting some of that back in taxes, but they did return it. And so there's just an optics issue there. So anyway, that's,
I think that's very helpful.
So many numbers.
David actually just said, thank you, that helped. So you're clearly on point, and everyone, I think, is really benefiting from the discussion here. One other interesting question that was posed in an email ahead of time for both of you is this question about the reconciliation period. Has that been a part of the discussion as far as whether or not low-income people can be shielded from reconciliations that might demand they return more money than they have back at the end of the pay period or the end of the year?
Nobody is returning any money. No household is returning money. The reconciliation is only about giving people more money. So no, that's not a concern. The reconciliation period. So it doesn't go both ways. No, this is not like the border adjustment. It's a dividend. You're getting money. Households are only ever getting money, and so there is a reconciliation. If the initial amount of money that people are going to be getting is going to be based on a projection of how much revenue the fee is going to raise that year. And it might be that the fee raises more, it might be that it raises less. So there would have to be a correction on the backside, but households wouldn't have to worry about that. That would just be the federal government and the companies who are paying it. They could embed that into next year's dividends for everybody. The only reconciliation that households need to worry about, they can take care of on a one-page form, and it has to deal with births, deaths, or people passing that 19-year-old threshold, or 23 if they're a full-time student.
Excellent. That's very helpful. Another question that was emailed in advance here, unless Rick, I know I'm kind of moving along quick. Would you like to say anything on any of these? We're doing lightning round. All right.
So, There
go
was a
for it.
question from Dee, what is the reconciliation period? And I think maybe that seemed a little confusing. It just means that once a year, along with your tax returns and on tax day, those who have changes during the year would file those forms to correct mistakes that were made, or that to get dividend amounts that they were entitled to but didn't get because the information was not available for the pay agent.
I love it. Thank you, Rick. And on that topic with, you know, we reviewed this statistic that 93% of households would be able to have electronic fund transfer. The rest would be covered through debit cards or checks. Was there, you know, who is that? Was it beyond Alan Lerman? Were there others? Somebody asked earlier, were low-income consumer advocates involved in kind of tracing that pathway as well? You know, did it seem like there was going to be, you know, this concern addressed about people that are living in poverty really having their dividend administered easily back to them?
Yeah. So Alan, you know, again, CCL was very concerned about that, and partly because of Marshall's background, you know, doing what he was doing, and we want this to be good for the poor. And so Alan created a very simple form, CFD1, which would get people in the system, and they only have to fill out CFD1 once. Yeah, we want to make it as easy as possible to get the dividend we would like them to get. We think they're entitled to under this program. In the questions earlier, before we even started, there was a concern about, you know, could we get to everybody? And the honest answer is no. I mean, this is a long-standing problem that many people have worried about and tried to fix. We're not going to be able to get to everybody. And I started to say that you could envision and this is in the FAQ as well, a CCLers doing an action where we try and sign people up using CFD1 to make sure that as many people as possible are getting this. And I think that's another thing that we could work with communities of color to help make happen. But you know, if you're being completely honest about this, can CCL fix this long-standing problem? I don't think we can. And then you ask a second question, is that a reason to hold up pursuing this solution and reducing emissions this significantly? No, I don't think it is. That's my answer, and I have no hesitation in giving that answer for me.
Okay, can I, since that was my question, can I just ask,
By all means.
one of the audiences that I'm concerned about is, you know, elderly living on Social Security, and with using Social Security to maybe distribute the form when they send out their monthly, their annual report on what you're going to get next year. Is that something that we could consider?
Yeah, I think that if you're on Social Security, we know where you are, and you know somebody is already sending you a check, so that's relatively easy. Yeah, that could be sent out with the materials that the Social Security Administration is already sending. I think that the bigger concern is people who are not in any system at all, who are just completely off the grid, and that's what CFD1 is mostly intended for. But yes, I mean, that is sending out carbon fee and dividend form 1 with Social Security checks just to sign up, not to distribute the actual dividend. I think that that's something that may be a good way of doing this.
Yeah,
And bouncing off of that, oh, go for it, Kathy.
Yeah, I did submit a comment suggesting, as you said, that working with the EJ people, because I think the dividend is one of our best arguments with them.
Hear, hear. And one thing I'd love to get your perspectives on here that has come up a lot in another email today, especially with a lot of people in the environmental justice community looking at this policy right now, you know, not related at all to fee and dividend, but with DACA. Is there any concern that using kind of this contractor as the intermediary would somehow give information on non-residents, non-citizens, non-tax filers that could then be used to, collect information on people that are here illegally?
Yeah, I mean, there is, so this is another one of those problems that I don't think you could reasonably expect a group on concerned primarily with climate change, solely on climate change, to fix all the problems of the world with one policy. That is something that our Congress needs to address. And we would like to give them the opportunity to sign up, but there are going to be people who are going to choose not to sign up because they don't want their name on a list, even if it means they're going to be getting their carbon fee and dividend check. And that is something that should be addressed should have been addressed already. And I don't think CCL is the best organization to address that as well. We can do the best we can with our policy. Again, we can work with other organizations to make sure that we're maximizing the coverage there, but we're not going to solve all the problems with this one policy.
Let me add something too on that. Is people who don't trust the system and say, I'm not going to put my name on a piece of paper, even to get this dividend. I think after a short time, maybe 1 year or so, when they see other people in the same situation who are getting carbon dividends, they may change their minds.
One last wicked question, if you will, and then we'll open up the phone lines here. I know we still have 7 minutes, but another one that was submitted earlier is about ranchers and farmers. And I know that Rick had a chance to comment on this beforehand. Danny, it would be great if you would mind also addressing this question that we know the things farmers and ranchers are going to do will go up, and the dividend return is going to be essentially at parity across, returning all to equally to all households. What do you say while we are making that transition and costs go up for them? What can they do? What thoughts do you have on helping communicate with farmers and ranchers to get their endorsement for fee and dividend?
Rick, if you already answered this, why don't you, I didn't hear it on this call, so it must have been via email. So do you want to start with yours?
Well, I think farmers and ranchers are just another subset of the business community. And anyone in the business community who is not getting a piece of this carbon tax revenue is going to have objections. But our policy is designed specifically to get that money down to the consumer level. As I said, that's where the money gets spent. So farmers and ranchers are going to see increased cost in their fuel for their machinery. They're going to see increased cost perhaps in fertilizer or some other things that are fossil fuel dependent. They will also have opportunities to take advantage of innovations such as the enhancement of the viability of wind farms and the innovations in biofuels that could benefit some of them. I don't know if those answers are satisfactory to the agricultural community where they don't have that much trust in the long-term promises of long-term benefits. But right now, that's all we have. We don't give money back to businesses. And once you start talking about carving out certain industries for favorable treatment, then the whole policy becomes complicated and impossible to pass.
And I'll just add, agricultural interests are a big concern because I don't think you can win the Senate if ag is opposed, just because of the way our democracy is set up. So it's a big concern. And what comes up again and again in the conversations I've had with the ag team is farmers are caught in a bind. They buy on a retail market, but they sell on a commodities market and a global commodities market. So that's a difficulty. But what I have found the most effective is pointing out they're competing against people who are dealing with the same costs, and the way they can beat their competitors domestically is by lowering their carbon intensity, which of course is the point. And on the border adjustment, I just had an email with the ag team earlier this week. We can't say for sure that agricultural products will be border adjusted. It's not in that 2009 interagency report, which did a lot of the thinking on this. And if you want to look at that, check out our Borders 201 CCU. But that we in our policy would give industries the ability to apply to be border adjusted. And I also like to point out for agriculture, is a carbon fee going to be better for you, or is it going to be a cap, which a lot of countries are doing, or is it going to be regulation, which there's no possibility of any border adjustment with regulation. So what are the alternatives, and where do you see the most? What are your competitors doing domestically and abroad, and what are the possible policy alternatives in which you like the best?
Thank you for that. So I know that I've kind of seeded the deck with many questions, and we're 3 minutes to the top of the hour. So for the last 3 minutes, I'd love to open it up to anyone that hasn't had a chance to ask one yet. Don't be shy.
I have a question. This is Sharon from Rhode Island. If somebody is having a problem getting their dividend, will there be a person, or who would they contact?
Yeah, that would be Contractor B. Contractor B is handling problems with the dividend. And again, that could be the same as Contractor A. It could be, so they would handle those inquiries and make sure that if there is a problem, that is reconciled.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent question. Thanks, Sharon. We got time for at least one more.